Chapter 22: The Short-Run Trade-off Between Inflation and Unemployment. In this chapter, these are the questions we seek answers to. How are inflation and unemployment related in the short run? What about in the long run? What factors alter this relationship? What is the short-run cost of reducing inflation? Why were US inflation and unemployment both so low in the 1990s? Inflation and unemployment. In the long run, inflation and unemployment are unrelated. The inflation rate depends mainly on growth in the money supply. Unemployment, the natural rate, depends on the minimum wage, the market power of unions, efficiency wages, and the process of job search. In the short run, society faces a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Origins of the Phillips curve. Phillips curve, or PC, is the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It was named after A.W. Phillips in 1958, who observed that nominal wage growth was negatively correlated with unemployment in the UK. In 1960, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow observed negative correlation between US inflation and unemployment, and they named it the Phillips curve. Deriving the Phillips curve. Suppose P is equal to 100 this year. The following graph shows two possible outcomes for next year. Point A, low aggregate demand, small increase in price, that is low inflation, low output, but high unemployment. Point B, high aggregate demand, high, big increase in price, that is high inflation, high output, and low unemployment. Upsloping short-run aggregate supply. Point number A, low aggregate demand, low inflation, high unemployment rate. Point number A. Point number B, high aggregate demand, high inflation, low unemployment rate. The Phillips curve. The policy menu. Since fiscal and monetary policy affect aggregate demand, the Phillips curve appears to offer policymakers a menu of choices: low unemployment with high inflation, low inflation with high unemployment, and anything in between. 1960s US data supported the Phillips curve. Many believed that PC was stable and reliable. There is evidence of Phillips curve. In this graph, during the 1960s, US policymakers opted for reducing unemployment at the expense of high inflation. The vertical long-run Phillips curve. In 1968, Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps argued that the trade-off was temporary based on the classical dichotomy and the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. The natural rate hypothesis. They claim that unemployment eventually returns to its normal or natural rate regardless of the inflation rate. Side by side, there is the long run aggregate supply curve and the long run Phillips curve, both at natural rate of output and natural rate of unemployment. The aggregate demand curve, P1, is the equilibrium. The inflation is low also at the natural rate of unemployment. In the long run, faster money growth only causes faster inflation. So aggregate demand shifts to the right, but the only thing that happens is price changes from P1 to P2, and that corresponds to high inflation. Meaning of natural. Natural rate of unemployment. Unemployment rate towards which the economy gravitates in the long run. It is not necessarily the socially desirable rate of unemployment, and it's not constant over time. This unemployment is natural because it is beyond the influence of monetary policy. Reconciling theory and evidence. Evidence from the 1960s. Phillips curve slopes downward. Theory, Friedman and Phelps. Phillips curve is vertical in the long run. Friedman and Phelps bridge the gap between theory and evidence. They introduced a new variable called expected inflation, a measure of how much people expect the price level to change. The Phillips curve equation. Unemployment rate is equal to natural rate minus A into bracket actual inflation minus expected inflation. In the short run, the Fed can reduce unemployment rate below the natural rate unemployment rate by making inflation greater than expected. In the long run, expectations catch up to reality. Unemployment rate goes back to natural unemployment rate, whether inflation is high or low. How expected inflation shifts the Phillips curve. Initially, expected and actual inflation equals 3%. Unemployment equals 6%. The Fed makes inflation 2% higher than expected, unemployment rate falls to 4%. So we move from A to B, unemployment changes from 6% to 4%, inflation increases from 3% to 5%. In the long run, expected inflation increases to 5%. Phillips curve shifts upward. Unemployment returns to its natural rate. So we move from A temporarily to B and back to C. Active learning, a numerical example. The natural rate of unemployment is 5%. Expected inflation is 2%. In Phillips curve equation, A is zero point 0.5. Number A, plot the long run Phillips curve. Number B, find the unemployment rate for each of these values of actual inflation, 0% and 6%. Sketch the short run Phillips curve. Number C, suppose expected inflation rises to 4%, repeat part B. Number D, instead, suppose the natural rate falls to 4%, draw the new long run Phillips curve, then repeat part B. Answers. There is a vertical long run Phillips curve at 5% unemployment rate. And there is Phillips curve downward sloping An increase in expected inflation shifts Phillips curve to the right from PCB to PCC. A fall in natural rate shifts both curves to the left, and that is from PCDB to PCD. And the long run Phillips curve shifts from A to D. The breakdown of the Phillips curve. Early 1970s, unemployment increased despite higher inflation. And Phillips curve was taking a strange turn, no longer negatively sloped. Friedman and Phelps' explanation. Expectations were catching up with reality. That is, Phillips curve was shifting. Supply shocks. Supply shock, an event that directly alters farms' costs and prices, shifting aggregate supply and Phillips curves. Example, large increase in oil prices, 1974 and 1979, OPEC restricted the supply of oil, which resulted in higher oil prices. How an adverse supply shock shifts the Phillips curve. The equilibrium is at A. Short-run aggregate supply shifts left. Prices rise, output and unemployment falls. So we start from point number A. Short-run aggregate supply shifts to B or SAR2. Prices go from P1 to P2. Prices rise. Output falls from Y1 to Y2. Inflation and unemployment rate both increase as Phillips curve shifts upward from PC1 to PC2. The 1970s oil price shocks. Oil price per barrel in January 1973 was $3.56. In January 1964, price rose to $10.11. The Fed chose to accommodate the first shock in 1973 with faster money growth. The result, higher expected inflation, which further shifted the Phillips curve. In January of 1979, price of oil increased to $14.85. The 1975 oil price surged again, worsening the Fed's trade-off. And in 1980, the oil prices increased to $32.50, and in January 1981, it further increased to $38 per barrel. The supply shocks and rising expected inflation worsened the Phillips curve's trade-off in a manner that we no longer recognize the negatively sloped Phillips curve. It was meandering around. Costs of reducing inflation. Disinflation is defined as a reduction in the inflation rate. To reduce inflation, the Fed has to pursue contractionary monetary policy, which reduces aggregate demand. In the short run, output falls and unemployment rises. In the long run, output and unemployment return to their natural rates. Disinflationary monetary policy. There is a Phillips curve at equilibrium A with a vertical long run Phillips curve and a downsloping short run Phillips curve. Contractionary monetary policy moves the economy from A to B, and that over time, expected inflation falls and Phillips curve shifts downward. So expectation causes Phillips curve to change from PC1 to PC2. In the long run, point C, the natural rate of unemployment is lower, resulting in lower inflation. What is the sacrifice ratio? Sacrifice ratio is the percentage points of annual output lost per 1 percentage point reduction in inflation. Typical estimate 5 to reduce inflation rate by 1%, we must sacrifice 5% of a year's output. This can spread cost over time to reduce inflation by 6%, can either sacrifice 30% of GDP for 1 year or sacrifice 10% of GDP for 3 years. You can spread the pain over 3 years. Rational expectations and costless disinflation. What's rational expectations? This is the theory according to which people optimally use all the information they have, including information about government policies, when forecasting the future. The early proponents of the rational expectations were Robert Lucas, Thomas Sargent, and Robert Barrow. It implied that disinflation could be much less costly. Example 1. Rational expectations. Suppose the Fed convinces everyone it is committed to reducing inflation. Then expected inflation falls, the short-run Phillips curve shifts downward. The result, disinflation can cause less unemployment than the traditional sacrifice ratio predicts. The Volcker disinflation. The Fed chairman, Paul Volcker, appointed in late 1979 under high inflation and unemployment, changed the Fed policy to disinflation. In 1981 to 84, fiscal policy was expansionary. So Fed policy had to be very contractionary to reduce inflation. Success. Inflation fell from 10% to 4%, but at the cost of high unemployment. Disinflation turned out to be very costly, as we can see in this diagram. Unemployment rate near 10% between 1982 to 83. The Greenspan era. In 1986, oil prices fell 50%. 1989 to 1990, unemployment fell, inflation rose, the Fed raised interest rates, caused a mild recession. In the 1990s, unemployment and inflation fell. In 2001, negative demand shocks created the first recession in a decade. Policymakers responded with expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. Inflation and unemployment were low during most of Alan Greenspan's years as Fed chairman. Phillips curve during the financial crisis, the early 2000s. Housing market boom turned to burst in 2006. Household wealth fell, millions of mortgage defaults and foreclosures. Heavy losses at financial institutions were observed. What were the results? Sharp drop in aggregate demand and a steep rise in unemployment. Between 2006 2009, the financial crisis caused aggregate demand to plummet, sharply increasing unemployment and reducing inflation. In 2010 to 2015, a slow recovery reduced unemployment, inflation between 1 and 2%, and by 2018, reduced unemployment below 4% and inflation to 2.4%. Conclusion. Theories in this chapter teach us that inflation and unemployment rate are unrelated in the long run. The negatively related in the short run, affected by expectations which play an important role in the economy's adjustment from the short run to the long run. Think, pair, and share. The worldwide drought has reduced food production, inflation has increased, unemployment has risen above the national rate. Americans are frustrated with their government. Your roommate says this economic mess has got to be somebody's fault, probably the president or Congress. A year ago, both inflation and unemployment were lower. We need to vote in some policymakers that know how to get rid of this inflation and unemployment. Number A, whose fault is the stagflation that is present in the economy? Number B, are the current inflation and unemployment choices facing the economy better or worse than before the supply shock? What has happened to the short run Phillips curve? Number C, if policymakers increase aggregate demand in response to the supply shock, in what direction will the economy move along the new short run Phillips curve? What will happen to inflation and unemployment? Number D, if policymakers decrease aggregate demand in response to the supply shock, in what direction will the economy move along the new short run Phillips curve? What will happen to inflation and unemployment? Number E, is there a policy that can immediately reduce both inflation and unemployment? Explain. Chapter in a nutshell. The Phillips curve, or PC, has a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. By expanding aggregate demand, we choose a point on Phillips curve with higher inflation and lower unemployment. By contracting aggregate demand, choosing a point on Phillips curve with lower inflation and higher unemployment. This trade-off holds only in the short run. In the long run, expected inflation adjusts to changes in actual inflation. The short run Phillips curve shifts. The long run Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate of unemployment. The short run Phillips curve also shifts because of shocks to aggregate supply. An adverse supply shock, increase in world oil prices, for example, gives policymakers a less favorable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. After an adverse supply shock, policymakers have to accept a higher rate of inflation for any given rate of unemployment or a higher rate of unemployment for any given rate of inflation. When the Fed contracts growth in money supply to reduce inflation, it moves the economy along the short run Phillips curve, resulting in temporarily high unemployment. The cost of disinflation depends on how quickly expectations of inflation fall. Some economists argue that a credible commitment to low inflation can reduce the cost of disinflation by inducing a quick adjustment of expectations.